That was a clip from a new film that just opened up in several theaters in the Miami area called Phantasm. And tonight on our show we have two of the people who had a lot to do with making that film. Our one guest is Don Coscarelli. I hope I said it right, Don.
That's right.
Who is the director, producer, just about everything you can think of involved with the film. And our other guest is Angus Scrimm, who was the actor, one of the main actors in the film. As you can see, Angus played the role of the romantic lead. Angus, I wonder if you could sort of, in character perhaps, tell our audience a little bit something about the plot of the film.
Well, George, it's about some of the loveliest people you'd ever care to meet. There's a lady in lavender who lures her boyfriends to the cemetery and then does them in a very spectacular way. It's very sweet of her because it saves me the trouble of going to the home to gather the last remains. Then there's an ice cream vendor who carries pieces of dead bodies in his freezer compartment. We call them corpsicles. There's a demon that dwells in people's hair and drills holes into their brains, and there's a set of dismembered fingers that wander the countryside, choking people. George, that's our crowd, and I'm happy to say that not one of them has ever done an act that was not totally depraved.
And Don, our young director here, you are responsible for writing this film. What made you come up with the story? Was there anything particular that inspired you when you were doing this writing of the story?
Well, I'd always been a big fan of horror pictures, and I just wanted to make something that was totally off the wall and very bizarre and at the same time very scary. Phantasm was designed pretty much as a scare show. I almost wanted it to be like a roller coaster ride where there'd be scares and laughs and then more scares.
So you do, is there any element when you do a horror film, this was your first horror film, it's your third film, third feature, but your first horror film, was there any element that you tried to put into the horror film that you feel is necessary to make a horror film work?
Well, I think, you know, you can go basically down to what scares yourself. And as far as I felt, there are certain things, fear of insects was one of the things. What I did actually to write the story is I went up to the mountains near my home and I rented a cabin and stayed there for a few weeks. And I found as longer I stayed there by myself, the movie started getting very bizarre. There, as Angus said, there's a scene in the picture that involves a dismembered finger that stays alive for quite a while. And that kind of came to me. I was sitting there with my, I had one of those styrofoam cups and I punched my finger up through it and I saw this finger in the cup, and I thought, gee, that's really spooky. Imagine if I was drinking my drink and there was a finger in the bottom. I didn't quite put it in that way, but...
One of the things that fascinates me about you, you did your first film, I think, when you were 18 years old, something in that area, 18, 17, 19, whatever, what's the difference? 18, not many people have made feature films when they're 18 years old. Were you a person who was just a film freak your whole life? I mean, did you spend your childhood in movie theaters, you know, non-stop watching 25 films a day? Or?
Yeah, I sure did. I was, well, not that many. I mean, I was really enchanted with films, and when I first started making pictures, especially Super 8 and other things like that, I found that it was a fantastic way to create a huge project and be totally absorbed with it. And I think if you look back on my personal history, I always used to be very involved in big projects. And once, I mean, I made a boat when I was in junior high school. I built a boat with a friend, and one time for a science project, I built this 30-foot hot air balloon. And so I was always really involved or got myself involved in these big projects. And once I started working in film, it was a kind of a situation where I found a medium where I would never find a project that was too small. It was always bigger and bigger, and it was kind of culminated in that first film.
It's rather incredible, I think, that you, I think you were a student at the time, did a film with a friend of yours. How did you go about getting that initial film into production? I mean, was it very difficult? Did you have a treatment, or did you actually go out and shoot the film and then present it to someone?
No, we came up with a screenplay. And
a complete screenplay as opposed to a treatment?
Well, at that point we thought it was complete. Little did we know that it needed quite a bit of work. It was something that we worked on quite extensively, and then tried to go about raising the money to do the picture on a low budget. And we came up, it was going to cost us about $35,000 to do the film. And there was really no way for us to come up with the money. We tried all kinds of sources, and what I ended up doing is I hit up my father for the money. He backed us for the initial investment and ended up going way over budget.
Naturally. Yeah.
But fortunately, we were able to involve Universal Studios toward the end, and they bought the picture in a rough cut, and my father got all his money back, and it was really kind
Based on a rough cut?
Yeah, the film was done. It was kind of an interesting story. The LA Times film critic, Charles Champlin, saw the film, and our rough cut of picture because my father had been on the phone saying, my kid's making this movie, you know, what am I going to do with it? You know, I'm afraid I'm going to lose all this money. So the critic came out and he saw the picture. I happened to have lunch with the president of Universal the next day and told them all about it, and so we showed it to Universal and they bought the film, so it was quite fortunate.
Angus, in your case, you have been a serious stage actor, generally playing the nice guy. What are some of the transitions you had to go through in two different elements here? One is the transition from film, from stage. What do you find the biggest transition you have to make? And the second one is, how different is it for you to play that nasty man that you just were doing for us a few minutes ago and having a ball?
Well, the biggest transition in going from stage to film is, of course, that you have to bring everything down. I haven't done stage now for several years. I've been working in the film and television medium. We saw Sweeney Todd in New York the other night,
yeah.
and it was great, and a great education to be reminded how large Lansbury and Len Cariou play those roles. You really exaggerate everything to reach that top row of the balcony. Actors from films, in films, of course, then immediately have to learn that the camera is right here, and everything that you do is already exaggerated. And so really, you just think for the camera.
All right. Now, the second part of that question is, how do you go about getting into character? I mean, I'm told that basically you're this mild-mannered, gentle man, and now you have to play this heavy, nasty, nasty person. What are some of the things you went through to develop that character on your own? And I assume, by the way, just before you answer that, when I said on your own, do you go to the director for help, or do you, in film, do you feel you should, as an actor, bring the character yourself?
Well, I think it must always be a collaboration between a director and an actor, unless the director is totally uninterested in helping the actor create. Some directors like, of course, merely to block and are much more interested in the technical aspects of the film. I read recently that Karloff said that James Whale helped him every step of the way in creating the Frankenstein monster, but that Roger Corman, for some of the films Karloff did for Corman's company, would say, "Oh, that's your territory. Just leave the camera and everything else to me." Don and I discussed The Tall Man rather thoroughly before we began, and we decided that since Karloff had been often a sympathetic monster, and Lugosi had been a kind of sensual Dracula, and Vincent Price had played often for comedy, that we would try to create a character that was almost totally sinister. So I began, and of course we decided to make him as tall as we possibly could by using camera angles that heightened the effect of his height, by building up the shoes to give me even more height than I normally have. It became a problem of creating a kind of presence, and so I began to think of the tall man in terms of a representation of death. And I tried to carry that thought with me as I was playing him.
Wow, so that's the main element you brought to yourself when you did that death. You know, Don, one thing that I think our audience may not be aware of is that Don, not only does he direct, co-produces, writes, cast, edits, everything but carry the lunch to the set, which is a fantastic thing. Do you ever get a fear that, hey, maybe I'm so close to this project that I'm not being objective? Is that, I'm surely you've gone through
I
that.
certainly do. That's the whole trick with making a film, I think, is objectivity, because you stay so close. You work on a picture for 2-3 years.
Sure.
And how do you know what's scary, what's funny, what's anything? I mean, you get to the point of just, let's get this movie done with. And so that's why I always try to bring in people that I trust and people who I also don't trust and show them the film when it's in a form where I can still make changes and get their opinions. Unfortunately, with sometimes you can't really explain exactly, and you have to wait until you get to the rough cut of the picture, and you can screen it for them. But it's objectivity is the worst. It's so hard to maintain that.
It's a hard thing for the layman to understand, I think, that they probably think it's very obvious to you, but you can be looking at a great scene and not know it after a while. I mean, you really don't. You start really doubting yourself that this scene's going to work. Do you use test audiences at all? Have you ever taken a film out and say and previewed it maybe to a I don't know, a typical thing as a college audience or something like that? Have you ever tried that? As a
yeah, with Phantasm in the rough cut form, we screened it for an audience and got quite a bit of feedback. I found that working with screams, one thing that I needed to slightly size out was the breaks in tension. You have to, that's one thing that's very important in horror film, especially in our film, which is quite a bit of fun, is you've got to have your humor at the right spots to give the audience a break.
That's a fascinating subject. I think that a good horror film has that element. If you look at even Hitchcock, which is not necessarily horror but mystery, he always puts that bit of humor in there to sort of relieve the tension. You build up to something, pow, you hit him, and then you let him rest
exactly
for a while.
right.
That's a typical formula, I think.
Exactly, because also there's an incredible relationship between horror and humor. I mean, you'll find that when an audience, when you build them up just right, and then the scare comes and they scream, you'll find that the immediate response after that is laughter, and the audience can't believe that they've been scared so much, and they have to respond by laughing.
There's one last question before we go I'd like to ask you, and that is, you've done all these things in film, just about everything, and including acting, which we'll get to in our second part of the show. But the other thing is that there's a world called distribution and a world called publicity. What relationship do you have with that world? Do you take part in the distribution process? That is, folks selling the film out there to different theaters. Do you take part in that as well as the publicity, the ad campaigns?
Well, I found that in defense, you have no choice. If you want your film to be seen by audiences, you have to get out there and fight with the distributor and fight with the advertising agencies and come up with something that you think at least is representative. The problem that you always have is that how do you sell a film? How do you sell anything? What appeals to the public? I mean, I certainly don't know. The only thing that I do is I try to hang in there and make sure the distributor gives it its best shot and also does something that I don't think is horribly wrong. I'm just kind of there to make sure they don't make mistakes, essentially.
I think there's a magic word called hype that scares me right now. I think more and more films are going to hype. Did this bother you at all, you think, in any way, as far as films depending on hype? A film, no matter how good or bad it is, the hype comes out and try to sell people something you don't really believe in.
Yeah, it's really a problem. I think the basic problem is that film, even though many of us consider it an art form, is basically a business, and there are so many people who are involved in it only to make money, and consequently they rely on hype because that's about all they have. And for me, I mean, I've never been in the business to make money. The money has nothing to importance to me. There's no importance to me other than I hope the film makes money so I can make another picture.
Keep working.
And some people successfully can use hype to keep working. Unfortunately, I'm not as adept as some of those.
I noticed that you did your own casting. Did you cast mostly unknown actors on purpose, or was that something you considered when you did your casting?
Because of budgetary reasons, of course, you know, most of the major stars were out of reach. But I had a chance to do the picture through a studio, and we declined it because their casting ideas are a little different than what I had. The problem that you'll notice in a lot of horror pictures is they always cast for the leads, the people, the good guys, they always cast perfect, beautiful people. And that's one thing that always tells me when you're in a bad horror film is when you've got to have somebody who's believable, a normal human being.
The guy next door.
Yeah, somebody you can really feel for. And that's why I tried to go with unknowns. As far as I had worked with Angus before on one of my other pictures, and I have to admit I was he was one of the first adult actors I ever directed.
Were you ever intimidated by Angus when you first started? Angus has been around a while. No, really, Angus, I think it's a very legitimate question because I went through that myself when I was in school in NYU, and I suddenly was dealing with people 50 years old who had been in 2 and 3 plays and several films, and I said, I'm just this little guy in graduate school. Did you go through that at all?
I think if you look back on it, that is why Angus is in a horror film now, because he used to frighten me so much when he played a normal part in one of my other films that I always thought he'd make a great horror actor or a great pirate. So
he's also a ham.
Yeah. Well, actors, you know.
Okay, I just would like once again to say the film we're talking about is called Phantasm. It is opening up right now all over the Florida area. We'll be back next week with the same 2 gentlemen as our guests. We'll continue our conversation because we think this film is kind of special and something we should devote 2 shows to. So tune in next week and we'll be right where we were last week. Thank you. Good night. I hope you enjoyed that clip. That was from a new film that just opened in town all over the Dade County area. It's called Phantasm. And with us tonight for the second week in a row we have